Hey everyone. Does anybody know how you on the Miro you can like name yourself so you're not a visiting artist?
I believe if you go up, you have to create an account. I think it's on the top right hand corner. There's like a toolbar, and if you you might see a little circle where you can find yourself, and then do like a right click. And I think that might do it. So yeah.
I did create an account last time, but when I click on the link, I'm sorry, I'm not seeing how you like log into your account.
I'm not sure. Yeah, you may have to just be a guest editor for now.
No problem.
But yeah, you can still add comments and do everything. It's just that we won't see your cursor or your name by your cursor rather. So okay. Thank you everyone. Welcome back. And we, as a reminder, as Karina said, and Marnie, we're going to try to give everybody an opportunity to speak first before moving on. So let's all be cognizant of voices in the room. And we have our subject matter experts here, Margaret and also Misha is joining us. And then Natasha, I think you are a note taker, is that right? Maybe. Okay, well.
Yes, I'm here. Sorry, I'm posting some sticky notes on the board right now, and I only have one little screen, so I'm getting it ready.
No problem. Yeah. So, and if you're in Miro yourselves, you can see Natasha in action adding stickies to the board as we talk. And then Ethan from Flow Analytics is here to help us on the technical side as well. So the question that we want you guys to ponder in this breakout is what impacted communities have we not yet heard from, or have we not heard enough from, whose voices are missing from these discussions, and how can we ensure that these voices are still brought to the table? And thinking about, groups in various forms. So like, what schools haven't we heard from? What communities have we not heard from, particularly our underserved communities? Also, the types of stakeholders, like parents, community members, students, teachers, who do we really need to bring to this discussion that we haven't heard from yet?
I personally would like to hear more from Bridger. I feel like they're so impacted, and I haven't really, they haven't really had many chances to kind of talk about, with these guardrails, it just seems so limiting for them.
Eddie, I find that shocking because I feel like all I do is talk, so I'm sort of committed to not talking this time.
Oh, yeah, no, it just seems like I don't know. The attitude just seemed like Bridger was kind of a done deal, and I don't know. I feel like there's more to it than that. Sorry. Thank you.
I feel like what was not said enough last week is that these were just proposals, and they're not set in stone. So I think, I don't know, I just wanted to put that out in this space again. And so just something to think
about. I'd be curious to hear from the families in the dual language immersion programs that are single strand, and how they feel that those programs are working for them, since there seems to be a focus on changing that. And those programs are also then driven to some of the schools that we're asking to hear from.
Yeah, good point.
I would really like to hear from Lent School. I don't think we've heard much from Lent at all. They have Spanish DLI. They're going to be very impacted by this. Especially their neighborhood program is going to be entirely displaced. And I don't know that we've had anybody from Lent at any of these meetings. Yeah, so we've heard plenty from Atkinson DLI and the other DLI schools, but I'm not sure where Lent is. Lent also feels important to me because they are a low SES school.
Hi, Carmen. Did we hear you're from Lent?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, I am from Lent. I was just going to say the Lent community. But
Great.
yeah, if I am a parent at Lent, and also I've worked within the Lent community for longer than I've been a parent at Lent. So I work various roles. Currently, I'm the Sunsite manager there. So I've been there for almost 20 years at Lent. So I've seen all of the changes that have been going on since the beginning. But yeah, I really feel like the information is just amongst staff and what they hear from maybe different meetings, things like that. But parents, if I went up to a parent and told them this is what's going on, they would not have any idea. And I feel like I will speak on this because I've been at Lent for a long time. I feel like this is the history of PPS at Lent, just making changes that affect our community directly, that impacts us highly, without taking student voice. You know, not just parent voice, but student voice is also very important, because we're adults making choices for children, but it affects the children more directly. So I feel like that's also my concern, is the lack of opportunities. We serve a diverse community, and really what it means to come, and also the history of bringing us to the table, and how much parents really feel that they're going to be heard because of all the changes within our community. So that's also a challenge to bring people to the table.
Yeah, a lot of really important points. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
I'm going to speak on behalf of the Lewis community in terms of where the boundary change is happening, which is different than lots of other things that are happening, but it's a fairly large boundary move. And it's the same in both A and B. And so parents feel as if they haven't had any voice, because it kind of feels like a done deal to them. And then the unknowns in terms of how will the board vote in terms of grandfathering in, will it be immediate? So what will the transition period be? And then the next side is how we as a district are going to support families in their new schools, which I think is probably for everybody, but in sort of how do you have those quick open houses, talk about what sorts of things and programs are in buildings. Because for a lot of families, it feels like they've never even set foot on the grounds. And so therefore it's really hard to say, well, now you're going to tell me my child's going there next year. And so that's sort of how do we build that so that it's not just your child's going there, but your child's going and here's all the good things that are there. And I don't have anybody in the Lewis community who is on this committee that is from a good portion of my building, which is where the boundary changes are happening. So I think that just within the school themselves, they're sort of feeling like, how do they get their voice heard?
Thank you. Anyone else? And please feel free to use the chat also if you'd like to share ideas in that manner.
Am I allowed to talk twice?
Yes, go ahead, because I think, yeah, unless anybody else has any comment, can Eddie go? No, go ahead.
I have a question for Carmen. Is your principal present tonight?
I did not see her. I looked through and saw, but I don't think so. You know, and that's, again, sorry to interrupt because I know Eddie was going to speak, but you know, that's also a constant change at Lent, if you know the history of our building. So, you know, taking us away from a K8, almost 10 years as a K8, and then to a K5, and then now breaking apart our community, because that's really what is happening, is you're breaking apart our community. And I feel like that has to be like consciously said, like you are breaking up our community. PPS, that's what they're doing. Because the number of parents that I can say that depend on each other that are from the DLI program and the other program of helping them get their kids to school, picking up each other's kids, like all this. And I said this in another conversation that I had earlier. The one strength that our community has is our resilience to stay together and to create that community that we have created. It's the only consistent thing in our community. And by you breaking us apart, that breaks us apart, our community apart, our kids apart, And I hope that that's a very conscious, that has to be a very conscious decision of what is going on.
Carmen, can I ask what community you're advocating for, just so I can capture your notes correctly?
The Lent community.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Eddie, go ahead. We have a minute left, but if you want to.
Oh, I mean, I just want to put a shout out to non-English speaking communities. I know in the Woodstock DLI, there's a lot of parents that don't speak English, had a hard time accessing this information, have a hard time having their voices heard. And when they did hear this, the message they got was like, this was a done deal. And there was a lot of just kind of defeat, overwhelmed feeling of defeat. Like, this is happening again. They're just going to make decisions for us. There's nothing we can do. And that was just really heartbreaking to see and hear. I mean, we had to communicate very specifically, like, no, these are proposals. The board still has to approve them. But I mean, just it's not in many cultures that my group represents. It's not very common for them to speak out in public. It's very difficult to kind of cross that barrier. And so I just want to make sure that those interests are, especially if we're doing it through a racial equity justice lens, these are underserved. They're discriminated against. They have a lot of hardships, and then having to pick them up and move, and now they feel like they can't do anything about it. I mean, it's just awful feeling. I mean, yeah, I just want to make sure that is kind of, put a spotlight on that. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jennifer said similar. All right, welcome back, everyone. I think that I'm going to go ahead and share my screen this time. You all have the Miro link as well, but it might help us to be able to all be looking at the same thing at the same time. And then Ethan, I'm gonna rely on you also to kind of do maybe a little bit of a walkthrough on the information that is shared on the Miro board. I know that we've all had a chance to look at that and discuss it at the last meeting, but now we're going to do some additional consideration, right, of each scenario, and specifically thinking about which schools are the most impacted and the least impacted, and how we can perhaps tweak these scenarios to the benefit of underserved communities. I think it'll be interesting to to look at some of the data that Flo has in front of us here. So, did everyone see my screen? Okay.
Yeah.
So Ethan, do you want to just kind of walk us through in terms of like the question that's been asked? If we were going to look at the schools that were most impacted versus least impacted under each scenario, what are some of the tools here? Like we have the racial equity impact graphic here.
Yeah, we just kind of to go up, we have a broad overview of each proposal. So proposal A and proposal B, and that can be helpful to sort of track changes on a broad scale and track differences between the two proposals. We do have the racial equity impact measures, which are going to be percentage of middle school students that are enrolled in a middle school that has an enrollment greater than 500. And same thing with elementary school students in enrollment greater than 270. And then we're going to have impact measures that measure utilization of buildings. So looking at that sweet spot of 80%. And then we have distance from school, so how far students are traveling, and that information is based on 2021. So if we're thinking long-term, that obviously might be different, but harder to predict since we don't know exactly where students would be living. And then total number of affected students, and that would be defined as students who are attending a different building than they are now. And we have that all broken out by the totals so that you can look at that, all students. You can look at that, just the Black and Native students are affected, and then just the ELL students are affected. On the dashboard, which the links to which are just over to the right there, we have essentially that same information and then a little bit more like to a detailed level, which kind of I'm thinking that probably as we talk, I can be pulling up some information that can be shared with you guys from the dashboard and show you how to access that yourself. Some people take to it really easily and some people need a little bit of time with it. And that will give you those similar sorts of breakouts by neighborhood program, by DLI program, by total school. So that can be helpful in determining what schools might be positively impacted and what schools might be slightly negatively impacted, what schools stay relatively the same. And then we have maps that are going to show proposed boundaries, very, very preliminary boundaries. Those boundaries come in secondarily after program changes have been made. If we make nice boundaries and then move a program in or out, those boundaries have to change in order to make up for the students that were lost by the program movement or students that were gained for a program movement. Anything else? Within the maps, we have total number of neighborhood students who are affected by certain change areas. And that's going to, if you want to look at any one of these maps, it will show you, kind of give you a relative idea of whether this is a really impactful change or whether it's a more minor change. Since these are based on current student numbers, that's something that you can certainly look at now and say that, you know, and calculate out saying that there's going to be 80 students moving from here to there, but thinking long term, that number becomes a bit more sort of relative to each other. Anyone have any questions so far? There's, again, to repeat, a fire hose of information here. I fully understand.
Ethan, do you mind dropping a link to the dashboard in the chat, please?
Sure. Let me get you the one that's really easy to remember.
I think that link in the Miro board, yeah, this is what it looked like. It's not just a picture.
And I was saying this morning in office hours, that, you know, bookmark this link. That's what I ended up doing.
I was curious how we quantify affected.
How we straight quantify affected.
Yeah, is that
So
just that their school is touched, or do we quantify the number of increased programs that they experience by going to a school, or
we're talking
increase
purely students who move from one school. So if you are attending school A and then in this scenario you attend school B, you will be affected. If you are still attending school A, you won't be affected. And so that's the kind of pure quantification.
you guys have the metrics on like how many students would see an increased program opportunity and more robust programming in their schools if they move versus it would be interesting to know actually the merits of the program based on how people are actually affected, right? Like moving is not necessarily an effect, it's that they're moving. If they have more or less program opportunities, that would be an effect.
Can you define what you mean by merits? As in, would it be a program? Oh, I think.
Andrew, if I'm hearing you correctly, are you saying if it's going to make a more robust program, are you asking for possibly what would make that a more robust program? So when, I guess that's my question, and then I have a follow-up.
And just to follow up on that, Andrew, what Misha said, are you thinking like, I mean, for example, you know, in terms of programs, facilities, different advantages at one site versus another?
I don't know if it got stuck, but what I started thinking about when we talk about more robust, am I muted? Okay. More robust opportunities. So the the number of students impacts your staffing ratios. And if you can have more staff, then you can have more other opportunities for students or different opportunities. Margaret, I don't know if you want to add to that or have thoughts, but that's kind of what initially goes through my head, knowing that there's many more pieces.
Yeah, I mean, I think, go ahead, Andrew.
No, I was on mute and I'm very curious what everyone else has to say, but that's exactly the lines. And it would be nice to be able to look at this and see not just that students are impacted, because I think that's kind of a false narrative for people, like, oh my God, so many people are impacted, but who's getting more opportunity is kind of the question.
So I think it's at the southeast, like it sort of is at the quadrant level. I think that's where the racial equity impact measures are. I think what you're asking is, how does that show up for each of the sites? Is that a fair statement?
Each student, actually. Not just sites, but how many students benefit. So it's not, let's forget the sites. Let's see who's getting a better education or more opportunity for diverse programming.
Well, I think that's what the racial equity impacts do at the gross level, right? Like in the quadrant. That's what they're saying, right?
But that would mean that if 3,000 students are impacted or affected, I think was the term that Flo used, that means 3,000 students benefit.
It is in the percentage of the students that end up in, it's the first two of the impacts, not the total number. It's the percentages up top. The percent that end up in the change. So like, for example, the percentage of middle school students with a greater than 500% enrollment goes from 87.6% of the students to 100% in the south, in the quadrants, right?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, it
one
seems like if we have that information, then when they talk about affected students in the dashboard, they could be saying how the students are affected rather than us having to navigate to do the addition ourselves. They've got a metric, they've got a computer, they've got a spreadsheet. The equation could be laid out in very simple terms. That's all I'm getting at. I know that if we dig, we could probably find that answer, but affected is meaningless if there's not a quantifying aspect to it.
And both Josh and Eddie have their hands up.
And I think the only way to quantify it is by how many kids are moving. Because if I understand it right, the target enrollment that we're going for is a build it and they will come. It's not that we're going to put more than 500 kids in here and therefore they get now access to programs B, C, and D. It's that we just know that schools this size tend to get more programs. Because I think that's really the target that we're going for. So it's like impossible to say what the actual benefit is, because the goal is a benefit for everybody by getting the numbers up and then hoping that everything comes.
So I think like Misha was saying, that the money would follow, right? Like the money would follow staffing. And if the numbers increase, the staffing increases. And then is that true, Misha?
Right. So it makes it sound like there's less of a plan around the educational, path for children, and more of, hey, if we just put enough of them together, we'll get enough money to be able to then now make a plan. Right. So they could.
So I'm going to chase this a little bit more to kind of answer that. Tabor, for instance, its population drops below the threshold. So in essence, those students are affected by this, even though they're not changing schools, and they would have a less robust programming opportunity at that school because of the changes.
I think that's something to look at. I don't have that exact number memorized, knowing, funding follows a student, and student count leads to FTE, but it's not like one or, well, sometimes, but like trying to think of like class sizes and programs. I don't know. I would have to see the numbers to see how much it would be impacted by.
Ethan, can you pull up Mount Tabor in this scenario and display it?
Yeah, let me
And maybe while Ethan's pulling that up, Eddie, I see your hand.
Oh yeah, thank you, Andrew. I think that was a great question. I think there's a lot of holes in these numbers, and I kind of want to add to that. Like for example, you point to like, how do we figure out it's actually better for everybody, or better overall? You know, obviously there's sacrifices need to be made, but if we're looking at racial equity justice lens, that makes sense. But what I asked last time we met, I asked for raw numbers, and there was some debate about, oh, this, you can't do that because it might be identifying. But I'm like, well, anyways, I don't agree. But one of the things is like, in that graph, it shows like Black and Native populations and what percentage of them are in, properly enrolled schools. And that makes a lot of sense. And I agree with that. However, the other thing that I kind of think is missing is that ELL part doesn't necessarily represent everybody who is ELL. There's students who have tested out, or from bilingual families that don't qualify. And give you a specific example, like at Woodstock, we do have a lot of non-native English speakers. Not all of them qualify for ELL. There's some that come from bilingual families. There's some from multiracial families. And we actually a lot, mine, for example, my kid doesn't qualify because we have 2 languages in the house. So the reason I asked for raw numbers, like, yeah, we might be moving a higher percentage of Black and Native, and I'm totally 100% for that, into properly enrolled schools. That's important. But how many people are going to sacrifice in that process? For example, if we're only talking about 20 students, and yet we're going to move 300 kids from the DLI here into Bridger, displacing another 200-300 over there, like, is that really better? Because I mean, we are ripping a bunch of Asian Americans and Asians that finally feel safe in their community. So like, the thing I want to kind of also point out is that, I mean, we're supposed to talk about the problems we see at proposal A and B. And one of the problems I really see is that there's a lot of focus on the academic numbers. Like, yeah, these are the academic reasons we go on. But there's so many other reasons that are not in these numbers. For example, feeling safe in your community, having emotional support. And I agree, there's structural things that need to happen, like special ed and counselors in schools and stuff like that. But still, like, there's a lot of numbers, over relying on these numbers ignores all those other aspects that are, like, you could be doing more harm by relying on these numbers, or just hiding behind them. Yeah, thank you.
Jennifer, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of think about how much time do we have for this breakout session?
We have, I think, 30 minutes.
Okay. I just kind of wanted to think about our airtime, and I was really interested to hear what Carmen had to say from Lens about, like, last breakout. It was really impactful to hear that you were saying, Carmen, that you haven't felt like that community or parent group has been heard. So I just kind of wanted to bring recognition that we've been spending quite a bit of airtime right now on analytics and numbers. I don't mean to call you out, Carmen, I don't know, but I was interested to hear more about what your experience has been in the Lent community in regards to this.
Well, honestly, it's only been a bunch of fear from staff and concern. And I feel like overall, it's just even the staff are not agreeing with breaking us apart. And I think a lot of our staff has been in the building a long time. But we also have, it's kind of right now we're in the middle because, we moved from a K-5 to a K-8. A lot of new staff came in. So I think that there could be a couple that are just not that they're not concerned, but they don't understand the dynamic. But people that have been in the building a lot longer can see the ramifications from these decisions and what can happen from whatever it is that is decided. I know that what I have heard is that our immersion teachers are not for this change, because and I feel like a lot of our immersion teachers have been in our building for a long time. So they kind of have an idea of how it would affect. And I see how I could give you an example right now. The simplest one to kind of show how we are, how we work together with both sides. The Dia de los Muertos just went by. We had Spanish immersion do the Sugar School, 2nd grade, invite all the other classrooms that do not experience to come and learn about Dia de los Muertos. And they did an activity. And so those are the things that get lost if you break us apart, because I feel like having both sides just brings in a different dynamic and an opportunity. And then I feel like we also need to look at the number, the racial makeup of the kids that are in DLI and that aren't in DLI, and how that's affecting, and what they bring to the outside of the DLI community brings to Lent, and the diversity that brings, that everybody has an opportunity to experience. Because if we look at the dynamics of who is in DLI, at least in the Spanish DLI, I don't know about the other groups, right? But in the Spanish immersion DLI, what students and what families are accessing that, and what families are we pushing out of our own community because they're not choosing to put their students in DLI? That's how I see it. I mean, that also I feel plays a big part to it. But overall, within the community right now, it's been mostly the teachers that I have heard speak about it. I haven't heard any parents. And then, but also, how are you going to hear from parents when parents, because of COVID, aren't even allowed inside of the building, right? Like, at least not in my school. Everybody gets picked up the outside. So I have very little interaction with families to have these conversations with them, with parents, because they're picking up from outside doors individually.
Thank you. Adriel, you had your hand up. Oh, Adriel, you're on mute. Or I can't hear you. Can anyone else hear Adriel? No.
We can try to read her lips.
Or you want to add it to the chat? Okay, well, oh, hold on. Okay. We'll come back to you. Maybe see, let's see if this works.
Can you hear me now?
Thank you.
Sorry. I thought I was raising my hand and I was clapping. Not to say that you're not exquisite, Eddie, but that's not what I meant to do. So I'm looking at the racial equity and social justice lens, right? And I'm looking at the makeup of our lead creative, Harrison Park, Lane, Bridger, Lent. And what I'm seeing is there are 2,000, nearly 3,000 kids at all the schools combined. 263 of them are African-American, 21 of them are Native American, right? And these are rough numbers. I just kind of rushed through the math. So I guess my question is, how are we going to impact the way that these changes, how are these changes going to impact those students, right? If the charge is to increase African-American students at these campuses, Native American students, there's this whole lottery thing to get into DIL. My son is not impacted, he's at Richmond, but if he didn't have sort of a legacy experience and didn't come from a Japanese immersion, he may not have gotten in, right? So how are we going to increase access to students that are widely excluded for whatever reason? Maybe their families don't know, they don't think of it, they don't have the options, maybe they do, on top of the fact that they're just not attending these schools. So we're talking about making all these shifts, and I don't disagree with all of them. Some of them I have a little concern with, but that's for another time. I guess my question is, how are we going to translate this lens and these specific goals of expanding opportunities to these micro communities that have already been traditionally feeling left out in these spaces? I mean, I can tell you from my own experience, there's a reason African-American students aren't in Southeast Portland, right? There's a lack of teachers, administrators of color. I mean, at a DIL split or not, there are Asian American teachers there, right? One of the reasons my son goes to Richmond is because at least there's a culture that he's opting into with teachers that look like that come from the language that he's speaking. But at, you know, so many of the Portland public schools, I mean, because of where I work, I do the math. There's 0.07% African American teachers in the state of Oregon. That's the entire state of Oregon. And so there's not a whole lot inviting this demographic into these spaces that have already traditionally been exclusionary for African American Indians. So I guess my question is, on top of some of the other questions about the shifts and what they're going to do to the larger communities, what are they going to do to these communities that have already been underheard, underrepresented, over disciplined? Just what are we doing to look at that?
Thank you. Really important questions. Dee, you've had your hand up.
Carmen, I just wanted to clarify something that you said. Were you saying that you said that the staff is not a fan of the proposals? Is that like any of the, like, so the hope at Lens is to retain the program as it is without any changes? Is that correct? Okay.
From the teachers that I have heard speak about it, they're not happy with separating the neighborhood from the DLI, just because, as I gave the example of the Dia de los Muertos, they collaborate a lot together and they try to bring each other into their classrooms on both sides. DLI to neighborhood and neighborhood to DLI.
And we have the same sort of experience at Bridger also. There's a lot of collaboration between the neighborhood and the non-neighborhood, and the teaching groups are very strong between the neighborhood and the non-neighborhood. I mean, we, like, culturally, it's been pretty inclusive, but sort of one question slash like observation I guess I wanted to make about the DLI programs in general is that, you know, sort of like a nod to respect and like trying to hear the stuff that we heard in terms of feedback from the representatives in the last coalition, as well as the community input. It felt like there was a lot of motivations between the different programs for what people are seeking out through the DLI program. Like when enrolling a child in a DLI program, there's a lot of different types of motivations that run the gamut from language to community to integration to, there's like all of these really like important reasons that people choose to opt their kids into these programs. And I think Eddie, your rep last time, I mean, she was super eloquent about just like, you know, explaining from an immigrant perspective, like it's not just about a native language and native language success, it's about a family being able to become part of a larger community. And I think that's the piece that maybe is missing from like the analytical representation of the numbers. I think that that you need, it takes a lot of community. I mean, Carmen, you guys are building your program, and Eddie, you're like super established, and we're kind of somewhere in the middle. And like it takes a lot of effort and buy-in from the community and a lot of sacrifice in lots of ways to build these programs. And so, you know, from our perspective, it's a little bit demoralizing. And we've had a new principal every 2 to 3 years at Bridger. We're a community that's like constantly in change. And so like the community has gotten really strong because we don't have any consistency with administration. We haven't had consistency from the district about enrollment and boundaries and space and all of these things. And so it's like, it's turned out to make for a really strong community. And it feels like sometimes the success that we have is punished by, you know, our administrators are so great and they're so successful, they get moved someplace else and then we get somebody new and we're starting over. And in the middle of this process, we also have a new principal who's not here tonight because she's overwhelmed. And it's just, it would be nice in these analytical discussions, like I'm spending all my time trying to listen to you guys, but also look at the notes and look at the graphs and look at the statistics. And this is just not an accessible process for our families of color to understand what is happening, why it's happening, how they can be involved, how it's representative of them. And it's also sort of ignoring the feedback about what people's motivations were that we have been getting specifically around this process of change. I think that the surveys that were done, the questions were really sort of like non-specific about what people would like to see ideally for their kids' education, but the really specific questions around the proposals that I think we had like 12 last time. There was a lot of comments on those proposals from the community about the various elements of that. And it would be nice to try to keep hold of some of that feedback as we're going through the process.
Thank you. Adriel, see, is your hand up still from the last time, or did you have another?
I have a question for Adriel.
Yes, Andrew.
Yeah, so are you guys native Japanese speakers? I'm just curious about that.
My brother's wife is native Japanese speaker, so her 2 children are fluent.
Yeah, because I think that you're bringing up a really important point, and Dee is too, just about the value of these immersion programs. And from my optics, for many reasons, we're from my wife is from Ecuador, I'm from Iowa. Our only living family are all Spanish speakers. Our house is primarily Ecuadorians at this point. Just, you know, I'm the sole U.S. citizen in here, or actually there's more citizens, but not born here. Our daughter went to Atkinson and had a really wonderful experience there, even though it's only a single strand. And she was what I found that class being, because it had a 50% native Spanish speakers and 50% native English speakers. They learned about each other's cultures. They celebrated various holidays. Not all Spanish speakers are Mexican, obviously. So they celebrated various cultures, and the kids in the school that are native English speakers all learned about that, and they celebrated together and became, their bias kind of disappeared, right? We're raising good citizens who are not isolated, like you're saying. The district can have predominantly white schools, but they're having the experience of other cultures. They're learning and growing with other cultures, and to this date, they're a tight group, and I don't see bias in that group. When I see what's happening with Lent and what you guys are talking about there, I see a focus based on PPS's belief that it's best for Spanish speakers to learn in Spanish. And therefore, the Spanish immersion program gets pushed into the Spanish neighborhood, which then, to a certain degree, is also promoting a sort of segregation. And I would be curious whether that's something that's desired. If these immersion programs are focused on the language rather than a cross-pollination between 2 languages, we start to become more segregated. That's a concern my wife has as a person from Ecuador, is that there's increased segregation happening on the east side. And rather than including and bringing people into, to diversify culture, we're actually creating more segregation. So I'll stop now, it's just 29 seconds, but all 3 of your comments brought that up in my mind. And I think there's some value to not segregating, but I'd like to know from those communities what they think is best.
Thank you, Andrew. All right, welcome back. So yeah, so thinking about this 3rd scenario that will be developed by Flow Analytics, working with the district, what are some criteria that should be considered as they embark on this? Eddie?
Oh yeah, I feel like this, it's tough to start when we don't know what the final answer or whatever is behind Creative Science School. Like we've heard some conflicting ideas from, at first, and then Julia Brim-Edwards chimed in, about possible solutions to that. Because I feel like if we don't solve this creative science issue, it kind of like we have to do certain changes. But if we can solve it, maybe there's a more creative way, or we can split it up, then that's a whole separate branch of ideas or possible solutions. So I feel like that piece may have, it's hard to kind of jump into possible proposal number 3 if we haven't figured that part out. Thank you. Yeah, and I also want to bring up that, like, what we heard from people, Dee and Carmen, coming from places that have single strands, it seems like they're making it work, or at least that's the impression I've been getting. So I don't know. It seems like there's just so many things that need to be clarified first. Thank you.
Thank you. So you're saying you'd like more information from those families in the single strand programs to see if there really is that. Okay. Who else would like to share? Oh, Ethan?
Yeah, I just want to provide a little bit of context and a bit of a caveat in that, you know, I think that maybe Karina gave Flo and us a little bit more credit than we deserve in creating scenarios. We take our guidance from SEGC and the district. So this is something that we are looking for input and guidance from the district and from you guys on before we go ahead and create anything. So
yeah, you'll run the scenarios, but the direction is coming from the district.
Yeah, and so if that helps provide some context for what's being proposed and what's being asked of you all, that
Thank you.
helpful.
That's important. Josh?
I think one interesting data map we might be able to get is, instead of the flow of students, the flow of dollars. So if we know a per student dollar that's going to this other school to get over a certain enrollment, then we can kind of estimate it's going to have this much money. I know that there was a concern, I believe from Woodstock, that they would lose their Title I money with these moves. And it was a significant amount of, I think they quoted $125,000 a year. You know, that's far more than we see at our school. So like, there's a lot of dollars at play here that seem to want to be leading to this equity. And it might be interesting to see that in the data flow. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dee?
When we're talking about centering the communities that we're trying to serve with the DLIs, it might be nice to have, maybe guidance isn't the right word, but just a sense of like agreement, which maybe is what we were asking for before, around what that looks like. You know, serving the communities, like at this point, it seems very like statistic and theory heavy. And so trying to figure out like what does serve the communities and like how do we have a meaningful dialogue on sort of like, you know, I think the problem that we are constantly going to be up against is that nobody wants change. I mean, I think if everyone was left to their own devices, we would probably all vote for everything to stay exactly how it is with no changes. And so I think the hard part in this process is trying to figure out like, how do we make the changes and they get buy-in from all parties on the changes. And so I feel like it's important that whatever the discussion is around how we're centering our families of color, that the feedback is like meaningfully integrated, that we're getting from those families, and it's really transparent, and it's also just really clear, and that if the feedback is contrary to what the statistics are, but then the solution that's being proposed, which it sounds like for most schools is the status quo, that changes do have to be made. I mean, I don't know, it's not to say that this isn't being done sort of thoughtfully with lots of data and lots of attention, but it feels like we're just missing something in this process of translating like the needed changes to like an understanding by all the stakeholders of why the changes are needed, if that makes sense. It's like this idea that we're like, well, we have to move these programs to these areas, but it feels so contrary to what the feedback is from the communities. And so maybe we're not asking the question of the communities like properly or completely enough, like, hey, if this program moves to your neighborhood, there's going to be fewer transportation issues. And then, you know, how to offset concerns that if the programs move, that sort of disproportionately lower SES families are going to be moving with the programs and higher SES families might be opting out. Like the concerns that we're hearing, it would be nice to kind of move this process forward and to move change forward if we could figure out a way to try to like integrate and understand all these things.
Yeah, thank you. Andrew.
Yeah. So going back to the dual language immersion thing, which I think is one of the things we're talking about, and how to advance on the next option. One of the things that I feel we really haven't had an opportunity to do is to kind of take all the feelings and emotions out and go through the scenarios and say, I like this, you know, not even look at what's wrong, but look at what rises to the top. And then you can thereby see what floats to the bottom, right? This looks good. This looks good. This looks good. In regards to the dual language immersion, I think that for me personally, coming out of dual language immersion and conversations with teachers and principals, is that the idea of a dual language immersion program such as Harrison Park, serving only Chinese and DLI students, is not good for kids. That they, that the diversity and having a neighborhood strand in there generally is a good learning experience. I can say that on the single strand programs, even though we've heard an awful lot saying it's easier to manage the schools with a dual strand of a DLI program, my experience is different than that. And even talking to the teachers at Atkinson, where my kid went to a DLI program, the teacher said they make it work. And there were minor issues with the district about making that work, which had more to do with pay and hours when they had to make up for another teacher than it did with the actual functioning of the program. They said over the years we've learned to make it work. So that impacts Atkinson, that impacts Woodstock, that would impact also Lent, because right now that's a neighborhoods program combined with a DLI program. So I agree with Dee. I think that we're seeing different things than what the statistics show, which is why I was looking at statistical evaluation, that actually when you talk about impact, you talk about what is gained and understand where the merit to all of this stuff is. So in a nutshell, I think a school that is DLI only is probably, less of my personal preference, and from talking to people at Mount Tabor, less of a preference. But whereas a program that has both neighborhood and DLI in it is more viable and better for the kids in terms of learning.
Thank you. Let's see, Carmen, I see Josh and Dee, you have your hands up. I'm gonna go to Carmen since you haven't spoken yet, and I'll get back to you. Oh. Yeah, you're a little bit faint, but.
Oh, sorry. This thought came to mind at the end of the conversation that we had last, where Miss Adriel and I believe it was Harvey or Andrew had talked about. I would be interested in looking at the data of who's accessing these programs, the DLI specifically, since I'm a DLI school. Just because when we started at Lent, it was kind of what Andrew was speaking about. We were half and half, half native speakers, half just English speakers, and now it has changed as being bilingual has become popular, and it's being more accepted. I feel that the same, the community isn't having as much access, and the demographics at Lent have changed. So our high school, our first class is currently, they just turned 21. A lot of them are turning 21. Our first kindergarten K-8 class that went through Lent. And if you would look at the demographic, there was a high number of native Spanish speakers at home. As time has changed and you look at the number of actually native Spanish speakers accessing the DLI program, currently the demographics of the kindergarten, first grade classes is very different. So I think that that's also who really are these benefits, are these changes benefiting when it's not really a high number of communities of color that are accessing these programs? And why are these changes being pushed in this manner now when we've been a DLI school for, I don't know. I mean, I just told you our oldest class just turned 21. So that's how long we've been a DLI school, good 10 years. I think that that's also something that's really telling and important to look at is the demographics of people that are currently accessing these programs and what it looked like maybe 5-6 years ago, a comparison, and how we're bringing in families into these programs. Is PPS recruiting families, or are we making it accessible to other families to have, just like Miss Adriel said about, are they having access to these programs, and how is PPS doing that? I would like to know.
Thank you. Ellie, I see you have your hand up.
Oh, I just wanted to correct a comment made earlier about Title I funding. Josh, I'm wondering if you meant to say Marysville when you said Woodstock, because I don't think Woodstock has Title I funding.
No, that sounds right, and I was totally guessing, so thank you for.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, Marysville is at risk of losing our Title I funding in proposal B. And that's 170,000, and it is going to be a big a big loss to us. And we have a lot of BIPOC students. I just wanted to clarify that.
No, thank
Thank
you.
you.
And Josh, go ahead.
I was just kind of wondering about the narrative around helping the neighborhood kids have access walkable, schools, while also co-locating DLIs and pushing neighborhood kids out. How that kind of works together, and what is the demographics left behind. If it starts to reflect mostly of what Southeast Portland looks like, I think we're going to be having more diversity questions, coming up at the end of this. So that's my two thoughts.
Thank you. Dee?
Josh was reading my mind. When we were talking about the guardrails, I think that was a lot of feet. We're like looking at the screen, and Ellie is here, and it's just the idea of like, what are we prioritizing? And it feels like it would be one of the guardrails I would have wished to have seen is to say that, maybe like priority one is that we retain an even distribution of neighborhood programs. If we were looking at the map of the district, that when we talk about which schools are closing or converting or changing, that we're really focusing on the idea of, because I think safety was like the number one thing that came out in the surveys from the feedback before, is people want to feel safe about where their kids are going and how they're traveling. And, if there is a way to sort of say, okay, like first thing that we look at as an overlay is that every neighborhood has an accessible neighborhood program, like just full stop, like nothing else. Because this discussion, like the DLI really dominates this discussion when there's so much more going on in Southeast from there. And then maybe like goal two is that, okay, once we've sort of like properly identified where the neighborhood program should be, then maybe we can look at where logical placements are for DLI, be it whole school or dual strand, or I think like just like those are the kind of guide rails that feel like they would be more productive for us as you're asking us to sort of have input on the scenarios. And I think we just keep asking you guys more and more questions about like, what about this? Or what about this? Or have we thought about this? And not that those have to be the guide rails, but just thinking about sort of what some of the overall feedback is from the different communities. It's like, we're all just talking about ourselves, and it feels like we're treating it like it's the zero sum like equation. And it doesn't need to be that way. If we had some parameters that we could all sort of agree on, that like kids should be able to get to school safely, kids should have access to some school that's within a reasonable walking, driving, busing distance, that the bus routes are reliable. And then we look at the focus programs, which is, DLI and CSS and the other programs, and how do we equitably provide access to those programs, if that makes any sense at all. But I feel like we're always talking about DLI, and I look around the screen at Ellie and Michelle and sort of all these neighborhood schools that I think maybe get drowned out in the logistics of where the DLIs are going to go.
Yeah, no, interesting point. Thank you. Let's see, Eddie.
Yeah. Everything Dee said. I think that was a really awesome point. Thank you. But I actually want to, the whole point of this is to make actual proposals, right? For Flo to take back, Flo and Ethan and PPS heads over there to work on. I would like to kind of reiterate what Ellie said and maybe make a actual proposal, is to make sure that schools that have Title I don't lose it, because that's a big deal. I worked in Title I schools, and that.
Thank you, Eddie. Yeah.
That's it. Sorry. Thanks.
As a guardrail.
Oh.
Yeah. Let's see, and Deanne.
So I have just a question from past experience. So I'm currently the principal of Lewis, but I spent prior to that 8 years with Hayhurst and Odyssey. And Odyssey was a focus option school, just like creative science. And we had to make a transition in Southwest. And so my question, and live through this whole boundary and dislodging programs and co-locating with programs and lots and lots of meetings around it. So I feel like this is not my first experience with this, but one of my deep questions is, have we really looked in Southeast Portland as to where would be a great spot for CSS? So where could creative science go that wouldn't necessarily be bumping some of these things? I'm not saying we still have to deal with the DLI issue of of maybe putting programs together or not, but is putting the creative science in one of these buildings the best? Or are there other schools or other buildings of PPS that we haven't looked at, that need to be looked at? So having just saying, like, we finally ended up with Odyssey moving to East Sylvan, which was an owned property of PPS and unused, right? And so we had to do a lot of work on that end of it to get it to be a used facility, but it was there and it kept them as a solid K-8. And so allowed for them to just run as their own K-8. And then everybody else kind of in Southwest had to do their own boundary pieces. So I just think that I don't have the knowledge yet in how deep Southeast the coalition has really looked at what are the other options within our neighborhood. So I just want to put that out there as a guiding question as to, have we been everywhere we need to do? Have we turned every rock over to see what really is the best place?
And Deanna, are you thinking then under a third scenario, really looking at that critically and expanding kind of our horizon? I
thought it might be, but because I really think that's an important piece. So if we want to co-locate with another building, then we're co-locating. So I had Hayhurst, which was a K-5, and Odyssey, which was a K-8. It worked. We made it work like many of your other co-locating, where two programs are in one school, whether it's a neighborhood and an immersion program. But the reality is most often focus options, if we're going to make the move, then why aren't we making the move to give them their own space to be their own school without having to bump people around? So
thank you. Regina.
Hi. Just following up with what Deanne just shared in terms of like thinking outside of the box. I definitely heard some parents speak about like the importance of, let's say, schools retaining Title I. And then I just wanted to throw out there, like, another way of looking at that would be pushing on the district to decide if they would change how they determine what is, what distinguishes a school to be Title I, right? And then along those lines too, if it is about students, we're all very tied to like the current neighborhood boundaries. Like, what would it take for us to, and this was addressed in the bigger group, for us to consider the redlining, the history of redlining, and what it would, like, what is there a scenario that looks at reimagining like different neighborhood boundaries as they exist now in terms of where communities of color reside and how, and kind of like the concentration of those communities. And I'm presuming that could be very different from like our neighborhood school boundaries, or it could be very similar in some cases to certain school boundaries. Just throwing that out there and trying to, I mean, if we're thinking about like how we can propose differently or think about situations differently, that's something that I think about. In addition to, I mean, this hasn't been addressed in our group, but I also wonder about like hearing from families, right, who are maybe more interested, who are dedicated to that K-8 model versus middle school and then like comprehensive middle schools. And then being at a K-8 currently, I think that we also haven't heard from families who are very interested in their students going to a comprehensive middle school and looking at, those changes from a data perspective too, of that impact. And then of course, looking more deeply at what that means across the district of what options, what greater benefit in terms of elective options all of those kids would get given those changes if more schools are like right size, right? If we're talking about economies of scale. And then that also being the case at, K-5s that are, that have, healthy enrollment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ethan?
I was just going to offer some possible answers to some of the things that I've been hearing about, but I also don't want to necessarily circle back to things if people would rather keep going. So I guess I just wanted to ask if there was questions about seeing the makeup of Lent's programs, for instance, which we have information on, and then maybe and then there was questions about where CSS, potential other sites for that. And I think that these are all things that we could explore right now, but if people are, would rather just sort of think out loud about these things, I think that's also totally valid. So I just wanted to offer up that ability if anyone's interested in that.
Yeah, we only have like about, I think, 5 minutes left or so. So maybe we want to,
Okay.
yeah, but but it's good that you're taking note of this and so that stuff. Yeah. Okay. Josh and Dee, anyone who hasn't spoken yet want to say anything? If not, we'll circle back with people that have already shared. No? Okay. Josh.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that it's pretty, like, looking at what we're trying to do with CSS and where we're putting it, it's really starting, like, the longer we talk about it, the worse CSS looks for going and displacing and doing all of these things to another community. It's also important to realize that we're being displaced by Harrison Park. And so a refusal to talk about Harrison Park dispersing or change, however they're changing, or their K-5 splitting up over the 3 under-enrolled schools in the area and leaving the Clark building where CSS is now, maybe that's the least impact, but it's the hardest to argue for given the temperature of the country. But there might be less impactful ways to do this that may not just be on everyone's the top of their list, because we tried to set a precedent, or we ended up setting a precedent with Creston and moving cohorts together.
Thank you. Dee.
I guess I just don't want us to forget that sort of like the overreaching. I feel like if there was like a guardrail that's happening here, is that we can't have this many schools in one cluster under enrolled. And so I just don't want to talk about, like, it's heartbreaking to me because the discussion is making CSS feel like they don't belong anywhere. They might as well go somewhere else. They're a great program. And I just don't think that's the case. I mean, like the resounding message from all these neighborhoods is everybody wants access to a school in their neighborhood, and be that CSS or a DLI or a neighborhood school or what, we sort of get lost in the weeds about what the specific program is. But I don't want to lose CSS from the Southeast cluster. I think Northeast and Southwest and Northwest, they all have a lot of great focus programs that are options for their communities. And I think Outer Southeast deserves to have that remain an option. So I just think that as the discussion strays into maybe we should put them somewhere else, I think it's important that we center the fact that they're also, a valuable community and piece of the Southeast educational experience, that it's not a matter of wanting to lose them. It's a matter of just trying to figure out where they can be, if it makes sense.
Great, thank you.
And I just want to say, I had no intention of them going outside of Southeast. But what do we have in Southeast that is a different, more viable option? And I will say that with the hat on of Odyssey is the only focus option in Southwest. And we advocated very hard to stay in Southwest for that very reason, because your biggest population comes from Southeast for you, but you draw from all over the city, right? So that's why it's a focus option. But the point of keeping it within Southeast, but I still think there needs to be a discussion on where else is there, or what's the most viable spot for it?
I feel like we need some sort of trust, or a falling off a cliff and catching each other drill, so that we can embrace some way. Something has to change. And I think that it's so hard to get past that initial, something has to change. This is just not going to continue the way it is. And it's just so hard for anybody to accept it or to figure out how to negotiate that. I don't know, who in the world has that skill. Certainly not a bunch of parents trying to parent their kids through COVID.
Thank you, Dee. Andrew.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious about, it in my mind, when I look at the proposals, I like the move of creative science to Arleta, or is it Arleta, better than to Woodstock. I feel like the Chinese immersion program, which is already there and successful, should stay there. My understanding, right or wrong, and I'd love some guidance, is that the schools on the south side of, south side of Powell are under enrolled right now, which means there is some room to move a program over there. And I also understand that there's not another option in Southeast right now for a building that's open and wouldn't have an impact on somebody. And I certainly get the problem of going from a K5 back to a K8. But especially at the same time where Harrison Park is being changed to be a middle school because it can offer a more robust programming. And then Clark is changing to an elementary school to keep a neighborhood program. So, I mean, it does preserve the neighborhood program, but it seems, what is the conflict from the community there? What's, I guess, because I hear creative science is an awesome school.
Andrew, are you a principal or a parent? Can you clarify?
Yeah, I'm a parent of a kid in Tabor, Mount Tabor.
Mount Tabor, thank you. Mhm.
So I want to appreciate the tensions that you guys are raising and thinking about what is true. And when we're looking at the number of schools and pieces, is that a move, for example, to say we want students within a certain distance, of certain walking distance, right, of a school, we hold that as something that is going to be of high value. There are implications based on, it impacts other parts of what happens, like how big that boundary has to be to get to specific school size, or what are the historical impacts of redlining over time, right? So like, how does that impact the demographic makeup of a school, for example? Or if we're looking at things like, we're saying, where do we want DLI programs? If we're looking at why are programs potentially under-enrolled, and who's enrolling in them, do you move them, and how do you manage that with students walking to school? So these become, you're looking at, sometimes the signals are conflicting, as a matter of fact, right? And then that becomes hard to resolve. And so I think part of what you're describing is, how do you resolve some of these challenges, and what would that look like? So I think it was helpful to hear some people like, hey, maybe there's some slightly different guardrails that would or drivers for the modeling that will lead to some different, a different configuration across the quadrant. But all the pieces are like, if we get to a point where we're making a localized decision, that local decision will have cascading effects potentially across the whole system. And so you have to go in between this local decision and what happens in the system, and vice versa. And that's part of the, the challenge and the complexity. But I appreciate certainly the questions of what are we valuing and what seems to be taking precedent. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great summary. Okay, I think we're about ready to go back in our whole room experience.